Ladies and gentlemen, I am utterly thrilled to have Thomas Jockin sitting right next to me on the couch. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you.
Daniel, it's good to see you.
That's amazing. So Mr. Jockin is in the house, and this is just a wonderful opportunity to speak with him and his thinking regarding ethics, beauty, the work that he does on that, some of his thinking on classical thinkers. I'm always impressed with Mr. Jockin's grasp on thinkers like Aristotle, his ability to integrate classical philosophy into conversation in a very elegant, precise, and constructive manner. And I know he's doing work on that, and I wanted to just speak with him about the work that he's doing on beauty, how it relates to his operations, and just to have a chance to speak to him, because he's sitting next to me on the couch, which is extraordinary.
Not over the screen, like we met each other 3 years ago.
Well, thank you for being here, Thomas. Golly.
Daniel, really, it's amazing. Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited. I was asked by Johannes at the Halkyon group guild to give a course on beauty and virtue, and I said absolutely, I would love to take a class on that. I think, and it's actually fun because even though my first studying in philosophy was Aristotle, I mean, reading through Plato, and I've chosen to kind of narrow it down to just Plato for the course. I think it's a treasure trove of insight that I actually learned a lot just preparing the course for it, and especially in just understanding what did Plato really mean, not as beauty in terms of imitation, but as really the kind of shining light onto true reality. So the path of the philosopher for seeking wisdom was actually one who seeks beauty. In a way, and actually, because originally I thought I was going to do Aristotle, because generally I'm coming from a design training. I'm an educator in design, and I've been just running. The reason why I like using Aristotle so much because his focus on function and virtue, specifically the well-functioning arete, excellence. I thought that's a very natural flow in the disciplining of and training of a designer, because that's all we focus on is the well-functioning of whatever we're doing in whatever field of design we're studying. But I actually found that Plato's take on it was actually a more useful method to talk about the intersection of beauty with excellence at the same time. So I thought that was the reason why I was so excited to just teach this course and just gain a lot of insight from the readings from Plato recently.
Well, I think the Halkyon Guild, with Dr. Neba Hauser, the class, I know Daniel Zaruba has done work on Japanese philosophy. I know he's doing on Being and Time. I think those are really important classes. And I think the connection between beauty and excellence is not something that is explored enough. And it's very, very real. And it matters. And it's very consequential. I always was very bothered, say, when philosophy departments that I encountered in colleges would, say, have ethics classes, maybe ethics of healthcare, maybe they'd have a survey of Kant, but there was no aesthetic philosophy. Yeah. There was no concern about beauty. And, when you say beauty, people hear that and now they just kind of think paintings, right? They just think art. But the word art is so tied also to skill. Art is not just merely like something you hang on a wall. Art is something you are. Something you do, something that you master, of which changes how you carry yourself in the world. And I think, like you're pointing out with Plato, which is just fascinating, is this deep realization that art and excellence are tied to certain levels of conditioning, certain levels of skill, certain level of honing oneself to be able to be excellent and thus see excellence. Yeah. And that kind of relationship between being, and then I'll give it back to you, that relationship between being and seeing, I don't think is appreciated. Like, how you are affects what you can see, which then changes how you can become further, which changes what you can see further, and there's this feedback loop between being and seeing.
Yeah, there's a belief that somehow knowledge is divorced from character. If I had to summarize what modern training, modern education is built on, is that knowledge is a bunch of stuff you get given to you, and then you're still the same person across the whole spot, the entire consumption process. It's almost like, quite frankly, it is like consumption, because you're literally consuming it, and then you defecate it.
Right, oh yeah.
At the final exam or some other litmus test, or getting a certification that says something about you, but you actually haven't changed at all, right? Versus what you're pointing out, which is very much this character etching onto oneself the character of what one does. Because your excellence in what you do tells you who you are. the just person is just because they do just acts. The temperate person is temperate because they do temperate acts. It's it's also kind of explains the nature, the kind of the chicken and egg problem of it. How do you become just if you're not just yet, right? And that's usually the answer is you have to. It's kind of looking at the models, looking at the exemplars, and imitating their actions as they're getting started. Right, so that's the thing. So usually, there's acknowledgement that you start by the imitative, right? But it does not end there.
Right.
And that's actually one of the biggest problems is that usually, for example, the study of aesthetics as a separate field is usually Kant or Hegel's usually this benchmark because of the argument of taste is usually used there. But that's not. But that taste, preference, all those things, which also has an interesting intersection with ethics, by the way, right? The idea of the preference is the ethics as taste is to aesthetics. It's a fascinating, interesting point. There's another dimension of aesthetics that was the idea of beauty related to not just imitation of likenesses, but of grasping understanding. Like, for example, in math, actually, I think the one that actually gets us the closest is mathematics. So when we see beauty in mathematics, what they're getting at with that is a beautiful formula or a beautiful explanation that actually grasps in a very beautiful way. I'm using that word adjectively multiple times. I would say usually understanding of reality that was not obvious before. So it's kind of pointing out that an understanding of, say, imaginary numbers and how they relate to the sine and cosine, for example. That understanding that relationship is beautiful because you get a grasping of reality in a higher level. Because from the consequences of imaginary numbers and sine and cosine, there's all these secondary consequences of explaining phenomenon in a way that gives you more unity of experience. You actually get closer to the one. If I'm going to draw this out further. So that's, for me, and that's the thing too, we talked about this off the record, the text I was reading that prepared for the course is Plato is not, usually we think of Plato as this very abstracted Platonist of like the ideas.
Right.
And these great abstractions, and we have to know the universal and just this huge abstractions. He spends a huge amount of time talking about what's called technes, right? Know-hows. Right. Carpentry and wool making and shoemakers and like all these like random pedantic things. But in reality, he's drawing out that doing those technes well is pointing to each one of those individuals' acts of excellence, which are different, but yet have something in common. And then from that, we can draw out the deeper realities of what is excellence in general. Right? That I think Aristotle takes and builds on that further. But Plato does a great job setting up the foundation of that understanding, right? That is a very much a you are is what you do, and then from there we actually can draw out kind of almost bootstrapped up from, instead of just these ideas coming top down, from bottom up we can draw out these realities of the world almost in a conditional state.
I think that was extremely well put. A few things. The connection between memorization and defecation is one I certainly hope to remember because that puts it very well. Because the way that we're trained to memorize knowledge and then defecate it is a description that I think is unfortunately appropriate, given for how we're taught to train. So I think that's a really great way to put it. Also, I've gotten to the point now, like, I'm so anti almost titles. Like, when Hegel's like a German idealist, right? And it's like, no, that doesn't really capture it. Like, yes, no. And like when people are like, Plato's a Platonist, that leaves so much out. And it just speaks to the problem with any of these ways to categorize or paraphrase these thinkers. It's never so simple. But if you're just trying to defecate the information, simple's all you need. And then you move on, right? But that notion of knowledge as defecation follows from a worldview of mere taste and preference, because you eat the food that you like and then you defecate it out, right? It's almost all to there. But if indeed thinking, like we're talking about with Plato, is not merely a matter of preference and taste. It actually matters what you choose to think, because what you choose to think conditions you to experience and be certain ways. It's not inconsequential. Like when we talk about the language of, you just, whatever philosophy you like, whatever ideas you like, whatever ethics you like, whatever food you like, whatever lifestyle you like, it doesn't matter. No, it definitely matters.
Yeah.
It shapes you. Now, maybe it shapes you in a good way. No one's saying it's necessarily bad, but if you don't even have this connection between, say, ideas and who you become and who you are, well, then you just consume things and don't think anything about it. Like if like it would almost be like, for example, if there wasn't any idea of different kinds of food. If we said, oh, well, there's just food and you eat the food you like and you don't eat the food you don't like. Well, under that circumstance, everyone would eat sugar. And they wouldn't even think of it as sugar and unhealthy. They would just, well, I like it, so they eat it. That's what we've done with, like, philosophy and ethics and everything. We've treated it, it's like a world where all food is just called food. We don't have categories. We don't have the difference between dessert and vegetables. Like, we don't have any of that categorization. Now, I just said a little bit ago that categorization can be problematic. It's almost like we have categorization exactly when we shouldn't, and then don't have it exactly when we should. And it's like we get it completely backwards. And so it's like in the world of philosophy and ethics and virtue and all these different things, precisely where we need distinctions and nuance and saying, no, these things create different kinds of people, we don't do it. And I can just imagine a world where if we treated food that way, everyone would eat sugar, of course, and then they'd all have heart attacks, they'd all be unhealthy, and we'd be like, what's going on? Well, we told people that all food was the same, and of course, naturally, people was attracted to sugar because they were pretty much told that you just eat the food you like, and likewise, you just do the ethics you like. You just, whatever art you like is whatever art you like. It doesn't matter. If you did that with food, you'd have really bad results. And yet it seems as if it doesn't occur to us that you might have really bad results if you do that in the realm of, say, ethics.
Yeah.
And you get so many consequences with that.
Yeah. I mean, how are you living a good life? That's basically, that's ultimately the question, right? Just like the question of eating good food or not is the question of health.
Yep.
Right? And idea is that if you're just eating what you like, sugar, not gonna be a good outcome.
That's right.
Right? Just like that, with health, there is also just, quite frankly, happiness, or just in the kind of fulfillment of your life.
That's right.
Which ultimately is probably the most important question to ask, right? And it's fun. I find it interesting. I think this time period is a very interesting one because very much most people, we just rely on our cultural norms to kind of get us through, right? And by the way, on the course I'm teaching, we start with the greater Hippias because it's a retelling, basically, Socrates, the characters, asking this great sophist, Hippias, what is beauty? What is it? And he goes over basically, it's a beautiful maiden, a beautiful mare, it's a beautiful pot. Like they just go over like examples, right? And he's actually getting to beauty is having a great life, to be buried, to have great children, and to be buried in wealth, and da da da. He's giving all these cultural norms of what would be an appropriate answer, but Socrates keeps pushing him and saying that's not the answer. That's not beauty,
right?
Universally in all cases, and I find that's generally kind of leading to the question we're asking here. Most people are actually ignorant of what they actually are, their priorities.
Yep.
What matters to them, what's significant to them. It's it's the equivalency of living a life of just eating sugar.
Yeah.
Right. Told because you're told by others. By the way, I always love the acronym for Standard American Diet. SAD. I'm drawing analogies or inferences here.
Oh, that's hilarious.
So it's very much that idea of just relying on the standard norms given to you. Because there's always the question, like, why study philosophy? Like, why bother with any of this? No, the real answer is, like, if we were in I'll be blunt, a functioning society that the cultural norms and systems were working great, and there was absolutely no, falling apart.
Sure.
Then you actually don't need philosophy.
Basically.
I mean, there's a lot of arguments that Plato, when he was writing or doing his work with philosophy, was because of the decline of Athens was happening at that time.
That's right.
Usually when philosophy gets involved when the systems are not working.
Completely.
And we have to readdress it.
Completely.
So just like that we just said, if you just go to the standard American diet, you're going to be a very sad state of affairs.
Yes.
Or questions of ethics, how do we live a good life? I think even that question, like, what's a beautiful life? I think that's actually, it really draws out that nuance of ethics and beauty and aesthetics, because ultimately they say, well, how do you make your life beautiful? It's a very powerful drawing out. It's not just to have a pleasurable life. It's not just to have a good life. It's just to have a beautiful life.
The connection between beauty and ethics is utterly profound. And the idea that we think as a culture we can have ethics while treating beauty as a matter of preference is absurd, and it will not happen. because at that point, ethics just becomes law, of course. It becomes blunt. And we were talking this earlier today on how there is a big difference between norms, social norms, and law. The example I was giving was, when you see a chair with a coat over it, there's no law that says you shouldn't take the chair, but it's a cultural norm to know, oh, someone's sitting there and you don't take it, right? Because the coat on a chair means you don't do it. The majority of society is those norms. You have to have law, but law is kind of blunt, and it's supposed to be kind of a minority of cases, right? But the majority of human interactions are mediated by these norms. Mm-hmm. Well, the norms, now, if you come into a movie theater and you see a chair that you want and there's a coat over it, why wouldn't you take it? Why wouldn't you take it? You have every incentive to break the norm at that point, right? Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's in your self-interest to do it because you'll have a better view of the movie, right? The reason you don't is because you assent that it is somehow a violation of quote-unquote excellence. That there is something excellent about not taking the chair, right? There's something beautiful and good about not taking the chair, even if it is your detriment, and even if you won't get in trouble for taking it. Yeah. Like, you can't no one's going to get you in trouble if you take that chair with the coat on it, right? The movie theater staff would probably not even do anything, right? What could they do? You've got it, and if they come around and be like, sir, please move because a coat was on it, you'd be like, well, they weren't sitting here, and you could just argue until they get tired and leave you alone, right?
So there's actually two parts to this. One is an idea of well-functioning that's a much larger scale of unit than one individual, right? There's that side. And there's also, we talked about this after over dinner, the temporal side, right? Ultimately, questions of wisdom, they're always questions about a much longer time frame of assessment than just any one particular moment. Right. What is the right act to do in any particular moment is not really that relevant. It's really more, what are the long-term consequences of this choice? And what is the kind of flourishing, or what's the function or activity over the long period?
Right.
I mean, that's true in business, that's true in family, that's true in any relationship. Right? That's actually generally that's the idea too, is that it's part of a relationship. It's not just an itemized individual getting what I want, kind of isolated from everything else. It's actually part of a communion in a way.
Right.
Right? Because, for example, one example is in Plato is the example, like, any of these things like tool makers or anything like that, they're not just doing, like, the judgment of actually it being good or not, it's the one using the tool.
Right.
So already there's already acknowledgement that it's not the assessment of the rightness of the instrument. It's not the one who made the instrument. It's the one who uses it.
Right.
Well.
Right.
To actually inform what's the correct answer or what's the guidance for it. So I just brought this up because you're reading this example of dysfunction, right? So an individual selfish act that getting what you want causes actually dysfunction at a larger scale.
Completely.
At a larger system. Obviously we talked about this over dinner. A lot of the tensions here is that norms are great in smaller systems with intimacy.
Right. When
intimacy is not possible because of anonymization or just larger scales, law has to come in to create law can be beautiful because of what it permits.
Correct.
What it reveals by giving, basically, use a Heidegger term, kind of a clearing space, an aletheia of commerce or trust. That is actually the requirement for commerce and for any of the kind of the common goods that the state is trying to enable by the creation of the laws. So, because that's where the beauty of the laws come in, is when it allows for excellence to reveal itself in a way that would not be possible otherwise.
No, I think that's extremely well put. And there seems to be a big difference between law as clearing, as you just described it, and law that tries to do the work of what is in the clearing.
Yeah.
And that's when the law becomes kind of oppressive. That's when you get totalitarian, and that's where it becomes very problematic. And as you were speaking, it kind of made me think how it's almost like what has happened today, because beauty is not, especially not in the classical sense, is not something that's prevalent in our mind, then it's like we're trying to, what you get are these movements of the community that end up being centered on like an economic partnership.
Yes.
And it's like Marxism, right? Where it's like, it's almost like what's happening is like, oh, we want to do what's good for the community because of ownership, and we're all part of the community, and we're all building something, and et cetera, so forth. The problem with that is that economics, just like ethics, devoid of a doctrine of excellence and beauty, ends up hollow and stale and empty. It doesn't have value. It just becomes price. We talked about it the net session. And what you see in these classical thinkers like Plato is the notion of like the dysfunction on the larger scale of the community is a critique of based on aesthetics, not merely like economic functioning or the state. Where like in Marx, it's kind of like, well, the group is bigger than the individual, or you got to think about like the class. And I know I'm not trying to like simplify Marx to the point, because there's a lot of importance in Marx, but really a lot of the critique against individualism today that you'll hear is very political, very economic, very much kind of based on notions of justice, of acknowledgement, and kind of different things, which all have a lot of validity to them, of course, but without this missing piece of some sort of beauty that you throw off if you're self-interested, then there's a coldness to it, there's a staleness to it, there's a loss of power, and you don't have this sense. It's like the difference of thinking about...
There's no love.
There's no love.
There's no love. So that's fundamentally what it draws out to, right? That the beloved and the loved are in a communion relationship with each other, right? And, Symposium's one of the texts we'll be talking about in the course. Obviously there's a discussion, Socrates being critical of it because there has to be a love of something,
right.
But then there's the quoting he does later where he talks about the ladder of love in particular. And he talks about how what one assents to desire and wish for kind of ascends oneself to want to come closer and become more like and move close and then kind of bring forth that reality. That's what we're talking about, this kind of intimacy dynamic of it. It's not just the cold commerce exchanging for utility points kind of question. Because also the idea of kind of, there's a little bit in Plato on this, but if we want to draw a little bit out from the usually Aristotle's point, right? It's a perfect friendship, of a virtue of friendship, is wishing the good of the other for their own sake, right? Which is inherent, isn't it? And then, but it is also, very clearly in Aristotle, it is also the ultimate self-interest is desire.
Right.
Because you get a second self of excellence mirrored back to you.
Right.
So wishing the good of you for your own sake, I actually want the good, I want the glory of witnessing it behold in front of me.
Right.
So it overcomes even these questions of selfishness versus selflessness, as well as the kind of like cold commercial, I need to get my utility points from exchanging with you.
It's so interesting as you speak, because I've been thinking a lot lately about kind of the dangers of obviously the rugged individualism, but then the dangers of the collective, right? And what's interesting, as you were speaking, I was thinking about, Karl Popper in The Open Society really goes after Plato, and he really goes after Hegel. And even someone like Jonathan Rauch, who I really like, in Kindly Inquisitors, is very critical of Plato, because he's like, basically the Republic is a totalitarian regime, right?
Yeah.
What's interesting is that indeed, if you read Plato through Marx, you're kind of reading Marx into Plato, then you see like the Soviet Union. But if you keep in mind that Plato's speaking from a place of this beauty, then that's a very different function of the collective. Mm-hmm. Now, since we today have been so programmed to think of collectives as communism versus capitalism, basically, and therefore collectives as merely expressions of economic or political relationship, then we have no way to really understand what Plato's saying. Plato is talking about, like you're saying, intimacy, like beauty, like in a love relationship. Now, of course, the danger of, the danger of the Soviet Union or whatever, or any totalitarian regime, is you must love the state, and that's, love Big Brother or whatever. But we must be careful not to read that onto Plato. And to think, like, when you're in a love relationship, and you were to say, oh, what's more important, the individual or the group? It doesn't really apply, because the individuals see one another in the other individuals.
Yes.
Right. And that's like that's the genius when Dante has that part where he says, God created the universe to hear I am said back to him, mm-hmm. right? Where there's a creation as a reflection of God back, and there's this kind of back and forth. What you see, as you say in Plato, is this reflective element, where clear lines between the I and other break down, but this is only possible because of the conditioning of the excellence, mm-hmm. of which makes possible this dance. And then I'll give it back to you. What I think is so important on the topic that you're teaching on is basically without this intellectual resource, you're stuck either choosing basically between capitalism or communism, to be very general, and between those two there can be no reconciliation, almost. You're just in a lot of trouble. Whereas once you start talking about beauty is ethics. Ethics is beauty. Then you start to see, oh, wait a minute, there's something about community, communitarian. There is that branch of thought of communitarianism, which I don't want to speak on, but you start seeing how these things can work together because there's a doctrine of excellence and fittedness of which the individual and the group can go together. But without that, you're just stuck between these choices that the 20th century has given us, and you really can't progress much further than that, and it becomes, I think, pathological and problematic.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I think a lot of thinkers have been thinking about going back to beauty, right? Because the question is, you can't go, if goodness has been basically kicked out the window by basically multiculturalism or other kind of a nihilistic view that the good is not universal.
Sure.
And if truth is being argued the same way, the truth can't be argued as universal, then ironically, the one we actually dismissed the first,
that it is hilarious.
It actually would have to be where we began.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I think the other important detail is because back in when we're starting in the first book reading of Greater Hippias. So one of the proposals by Socrates of what the beautiful is the fitting. So he brings that up. Now, it's interesting because then is that not just utility? Right. So that's what's fascinating. So that's why I'm really excited to start there because there's actually a very important question that wasn't this beautiful, just useful for you? It's just pragmatic. It's just practical.
Absolutely.
Right. He acknowledges there's a tension in that, and he even thinks. So the problem is for example, that in that part of the text, he talks about the guy originally started where they thought, adornments would make things beautiful. So we add gold to anything, it becomes beautiful. And then he makes an argument, well, then is the golden ladle, when we get soup, beautiful? Or is the wooden ladle actually beautiful? Because it's actually doing its function. Right. So there's actually, this text, what I like about it, setting up this text, is we're going to be looking for these dialectic tensions and trying to draw out the nuances Plato is trying to help us understand. Right, of the tension between the useful and fitting, right, versus it seems to point to a little bit what we're talking about, but not totally, not in a complete sense.
That is such a fascinating topic, because in the same way, I've been recently really, really fascinated by point, I think, 360 in the Gay Science, where Nietzsche says will and purpose are not the same. But what in the world? And he's actually the problem is that will has been reduced to purpose. And that's where it's lost all its power. And he says something like, we're confusing the molten core with the steam. And it's an extraordinary claim because it's almost like he wants to say that will always leads to purpose, but purpose doesn't necessarily include will.
Yeah.
And so there's something to, yes, there's something where beauty is a kind of fittingness, but not everything fitting is beautiful. And this is what's interesting. There's something about beauty where you need a lot of things line up, but along the way, it's easy to mistake one of the things that need to line up with the whole.
Yep.
And that is what we cannot do. But it's really easy to make that mistake when you have a modern paradigm of reductionism, where finding the part, it's fittedness, we found the part. It's no, it's not the same. And also, and then I'll give it back to you, it reminds me of, everyone always talks about how Nietzsche critiques religion, and obviously he does. But one of the other things he critiques is pragmatism. He's pragmatism and utility are just ways. He's basically what you're doing at that point is you're hiding from yourself to need to find values for yourself because you just say, oh, this is practical, therefore I'll do it. And he's it's funny. Nietzsche's it's funny. It just happens to be the case that usually what's practical is what's good for the socioeconomic order. And he's pragmatism becomes this way for a person to hide doing anything for themselves, right? Because also with pragmatism, it's I didn't decide it was valuable. It just is practical, right? So you're outsourcing responsibility. So Nietzsche sees pragmatism as a kind of escapism, just as bad as religion. Just, for Nietzsche. Now, obviously, it depends on what you mean by religion. Obviously, it means what you mean by pragmatism. But for me, this also gets why the distinction that I always hark on and find really important, the difference between empiricism, pragmatism, and phenomenology is so important. Because there's something phenomenological in pragmatism, isn't there? You're observing, you're seeing, you're doing, and yet phenomenology is not the same as pragmatism.
Yes.
Even if there's overlap. And you see getting those distinct in the same way that will is not the same as purpose, even if there's overlap. And likewise, there's something that involves fittingness in beauty, but it's not merely fittingness. And that muscle of going, okay, yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. That's one of the things that philosophy will train you to do that is so important to do. Yeah. And before I forget the other thing I was going to say earlier, how you were saying philosophy tends to come in when you have decline. Yeah, usually children don't have to go on diets, do they?
Yes,
It's usually the diet, the need for the diet shows up later in life. Mm-hmm. And that is what I think is so important to get it. Yeah, usually you don't need philosophy if you're just got given sociological order, but it's when stuff is breaking down that philosophy becomes a necessity. Precisely in the same way that diet and health become much more pronounced concerns as you get older, and when you're a kid you're not. So it's important to grasp that.
Of course, as building that point, it's always easier though when you're younger to actually use that equipment.
Yes. That's kind of the irony. Absolutely.
Yes. By the way, just so now you're going to this phenomenology discussion, right? The last point they get to in the Greater Hippias is saying beauty is feeling of joy. So I thought that's usually, I think, the closest Plato gets to the kind of subjective preferencing kind of mode, but not necessarily, because that use of joy is a really particular word. It's not pleasure in and of itself.
Right.
Joy is something it's a very different property. It's a kind of emanation, right? A kind of, it's not like the titillation of getting something you want. It's something it's a much more brighter effect.
Yeah.
If I had to put a word to it. So I think that's again like the idea that beauty is all these components all together. They're not just one part, because if it's just titillation, then that's not beauty. That's just preferencing or just some other thing like that. If it's not usefulness, because that's just utility points, and that's again not beauty by in and of itself. It's not this one thing, and that's what that first Greater Hippias is to set up these problems that the rest of the text, looking through the nature of love. And actually, by the way, just a fun side note about it, I always found this amazing. Plato has this really interesting argument what predication is. And it's in Phaedrus more, so that's the third text we read. It's the idea that predication is excessive desire. I thought that is fascinating. Because I just remember we didn't have the discussion about it, but you were part of a group that talked about lack as access as access. I thought of that instantly, right? And thinking about that is like, what is even a name? Because ultimately, what this project of beauty is doing, I see in Plato's work, is getting at some of his most fundamental questions of the one and many.
Yes.
And the idea of what exactly is predication. So when we predicate of something, what are we exactly doing? What are we describing here? What function is actually happening here? So these are so actually by investigating beauty, we're actually getting the training of the entire Platonic process of some of his most core concepts of substance and oneness and many and predication. And by the way, also, you see a preview of that in the Greater Hippias, because the second part of it is basically the question of counting. It's actually really funny, because he points out to Socrates, because there's a little preview in the beginning where it's like Hippias is talking about his time in Sparta, and they were like, oh, those guys are so ignorant, don't even know how to count. Fast forward towards the end of the dialogue, Socrates is pointing out to Hippias, by the way, so when we say right now we're a group of two, are we two or are we one? And then it's actually a mirror back of, it's kind of a hilarious mirroring to make Hippias look an idiot. Because then there's a gigantic discussion of what predication, like how can you be affected by something, not affected by something, but be predicated of it.
Yeah,
it's fascinating.
Well, that excellent. And I've always kind of felt, I'll talk a lot about the phenomenology of the artist, and for me, there's a very real sense in which a lot of the terms, like you were bringing up, like on substance, essence, the one, the many. The gravity, the meaning of these terms and their role is very hard to get if you've never had the experience of trying to create something, or had the experience of like ballroom dance, or had like these creative acts. Because in that, like in a ballroom dance or like real dancing, for example, you really do see it's like, yeah, we're two, but we're not. Like you're one and you're two. Like you start to see that. Where in like a lot of like everyday, say, work life, these questions aren't really pressing because there's clear divisions between you and the other person. There's no dilemma of the one and the many. There's no real need to be concerned about essence, substance, and form and all these different terms. But when you're in these like really deep acts, they usually have a lot to do with training, frankly, a lot of work, then you start seeing the very tactile, like the very present imperative of these dilemmas. And I don't think it's by chance then in a society that isn't, say, concerned of thinking about arts in terms of excellence, only in terms of, say, entertainment or consumption, that then the very, very pressing reality of these philosophical subjects is not understood, because you really get them in the act of doing these things, that these dilemmas are real, and they arrive at some, and they require very serious questioning to get at the heart of them. Which again, like if all we have is asking about the question of the one and the many in terms of economics, capitalism, communism, politics, or whatever, then we can only approach those in terms of one or the other, right? But if you think of it in like an artistic context or an excellence context, well, then you can start saying, no, it's somehow both if a certain conditioning is met. Yeah. Like you can find the quote-unquote harmony between the one and the many if the many and the one meet the conditions, you know, that they do the work of being excellent in a certain way. And then also, like on your saying about joy, I think it's very obvious that there's a radical difference between eating a cookie and winning a wrestling match.
There you go.
You know, like eating a cookie is nice. Winning a wrestling match could be something you talk about for the next 20 years.
Yeah, it's a victory.
It's a victory. And there's something about beauty that's so much tied to victory, where it's a sense of like beholding beauty is like, I did it. I arrived here. I worked. It's like there is definitely a feeling when you encounter something truly beautiful of, wow, the work paid off. And it's like not even easy to say what the work was. It was like the work of living. The work of, oh, we got, yes. It's like there's a victory feeling in it. And that, it's like the victory of life. It's a very interesting phenomenological experience. Like
there's just greatness.
Yeah.
So, for example, even things that, because those are examples where you're participating in some way. But even just, for example, witnessing a sunset.
Sure.
Right? There's a greatness that you're realizing. There's a kind of, I guess the closer we can maybe say sublime quality.
Sure.
Maybe Kant did a good job drawing out what we're getting at with that. But there's something more. There's something more than us.
Completely.
Like, if I had to draw, kind of flesh this out, what you're pointing out, like the cookie, especially if you just ate the cookie, you do nothing to work to make it. It's literally a consummatory one act.
Yes.
Right? The moment of sensation is all there is.
Yes.
Versus there's a larger story.
Yes.
A larger framework.
Yes.
A larger relationship.
Yes.
In the other two examples. So like the wrestling match and victory. But I compete as a boxer, so I know this, is those victories, that feeling, that elation, that joy of the victory is because of everything that had to be done to get there.
That's right.
Likewise, you see a sunset, it's taking the awareness of everything that's happening.
That's right.
This is partly why when we talk about why we should train in the arts, even if we don't do any arts in the rest of our lives, is with our understanding of training in the arts, we have a deeper appreciation of what's before us.
Yes.
Right, so we understand how light works, how color works, how composition works. For example, all these details. Or music, you can appreciate beautiful music because you understand the structures and systems and you usually would do this, but he did this instead, and that was a huge surprise.
Yes.
As an example. Yeah.
It is, you know, and as we come to the close here, and I think, you see, a lot of times when we hear kind of, you know, when you go to school, and I'll never forget it because I kind of vomited, but with a poetry, the professor was like, and the point of poetry is pleasure. I remember being like so uncomfortable with that because I'm like, yes, but, and that's a huge but. And the reason why, like in the humanities, it's like, well, you know, it's good to appreciate culture. Because when you look back and they talk about culture, right? And you're kind of like, oh, because it's like elitist. The key is when we're talking about beauty and appreciation, like sunset appreciation.
I have a story for that. I'm
Please.
sorry to interrupt you.
No.
I don't want to forget. Because I actually remember this. I was in a group panel for in design education for type, and I remember on that elitist argument. I didn't have an answer at the time. It's actually a great example of why philosophy matters. Because I was in a position of authority because I was one of the roundtable discussion members. I was the youngest though. Sure. I was like in my mid-20s at that point. One of the more senior members maybe said, "Oh, these arts, like training in typography, so elitist. You have to." I mean, a very typical Marxist argument. You have to have the time and the money. You know, I knew it was wrong what she was saying. I didn't have the articulation why. but I do. That's why I'm reminded of that from you bringing this up. Is if we make the argument about freedom, idea that if everyone has perception equally, and if one just cultivates their perception, they actually gain a deeper understanding, a power, a freedom. Then it's actually not the elitist argument they're making, or at least the kind of oppressive elitism they're making the argument for. Instead, it's actually the pathway to freedom and to powers and to understanding.
It would be very difficult for me to express my appreciation of the point that you has just made. This entire idea that the stressing of beauty is somehow elitist, it is the exact opposite.
Because everyone has access to it.
It gives everyone has access to beauty.
Yeah.
Beauty. What happens if you don't have beauty? The meaning crisis, mental health, the boredom. And you know who is really controllable? Bored people. Mm-hmm. Like if the average person on planet Earth is passive and bored and just looking for titillation because they're not cultivated and conditioned for excellence, they're far easier to control. Mm-hmm. Like why are the algorithms so effective, right, at controlling people? Because the majority of people are simply following titillation. Because if you don't have the cultivation of beauty, what else is there but titillation? Beauty is not a matter of elitism. Sure, maybe owning paintings and owning museums is a matter of elitism, and maybe there's something to be said about cultural production being matters of elitism, but one must not conflate cultural production with beauty in terms of phenomenological perception. And that's why phenomenology, what you're getting at is a huge deal. Because when everyone's just talking about culture as something somehow elitist, you are literally defining a path to freedom from the average person, from boredom, from passivity, from being controlled by titillation. You are literally saying that is elitist, and therefore if you do it, you're elitist. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's what the elites want. Maybe the elites want...
Well, how convenient. You knocked the ladder down after you got up it.
That's what I'm saying. Like, this whole idea that beauty is elite is something I just wonder if the elites love. Because then you can't do it without being elite, and that's bad, so you don't do it, and now you're controllable. You're not liberating your perception.
Also guarantees those already in positions of power they keep their power.
Yes, this argument drives me nuts because it's the exact opposite. And a lot of times in the Marxist tradition, it's exactly what Marxists say. They'll be like, oh, the arts and all of that is the domain of the elites, yep. Right? Don't get me wrong, it could be. But also amusement parks could be the domain of the elites. There is nothing that can't be the domains of the elites. I mean, a lot of the billionaires are now buying all the farmland, right? Because of a hedge against inflation. So farming can be something of the elites. Everything.
Well, especially the Instagram codification of it. Right?
Yes. So
the kind of fetishization of farm life and rural.
Yes. It starts with a T and I can't think of it. Yeah. There's this kind of fetishization of it, and everything, not just anything can be turned into elitism, products of control, whatever. It's cultural production. When all these people are talking about that, the Frankfurt School or whatever, it can certainly happen with cultural production, of course. But you must not treat all beauty as merely cultural production. Because the ability to condition and cultivate your perception, mm-hmm. which therefore cultivates and transforms what you can participate in, mm-hmm. which therefore changes you, mm-hmm. which therefore empowers you, yep. and therefore makes you more capable of being free, and therefore more capable of achieving victory, that's the road of freedom.
Yeah.
And you are literally defining that road as elitism in a manner that says don't do it. It's funny because it's like the difference between elite and excellence. You're saying that's elite, don't do it. In a sense, if it's elite, that's all the reason to do it, yes. right? Don't you want to be elite? But the problem is, here's the thing. Because we don't have aesthetics, the only category for elite we have is economic. Class.
Yes.
Status. And that's bad. Because of Marx, elite is bad. But if you have this tradition that you find in Plato of elite being tied to art, mm-hmm. which is different from class, then elite is excellence. And you want to be excellent, don't you? Who wants to be mediocre? We don't even have these categories. We can't even hear the word mediocre or elite and not think in terms of class. And as a result, being elite, which is a road to freedom and beauty, therefore is a road we cut off from ourselves because we can't think of it but a mechanism. We can't think of it as anything but a mechanism of oppression.
Yeah, this is interesting. I know a lot of rich people that are very mediocre.
It would be, in my experience, this whole idea that the rich are elite is completely the opposite.
The more money people have, the more mediocre I find them. Now, that's not always the case.
Not always.
Not always, but if we're talking very often, well, let me put it, let me back up. There is no correlation between being elite and being rich. Zero. You know, there could be, but there may not be.
Yeah.
It just doesn't go together. And, you know, everyone all the time likes to say correlation is not causation, except in this instance, right? And then, you know, that's one of those blunt tools, and it's like, what else is causation but correlation? You know, the problem is that a given correlation is not causal, right? You have to follow. Now, anyway, that's another phrase I want to go crazy on, like causation is not correlation. It depends on what you mean by that. Anyway, this whole idea that the excellence in the arts and elitism go together has been poisoned. Has been utterly poisoned because it means that people have cut themselves off from a road that would cultivate their ability to be free and to have victory and to have a kind of excellence in life. And if you don't have that, well then you have the meaning crisis. Yeah, you have boredom. Yeah, you have this misery.
Well, it's very much this idea. You're not at the locus of your own control, your existence.
No,
you're just a victim of whatever gets posed onto you.
Yes, and of course there is reality to the class analyzation that you see in Marx. Of course, but of course, you know, is that it? Is that the story? And then it's over. Then the game is over. Then the only option then is tearing everything down, right? And if that's the only name of the game, if you're going to tear it, you see, and then you see that there's a big revolutionary spirit that people have, and don't get me wrong, there's a place for revolution, there's a place for reformation, but the other point that I think is just so important is without this understanding of the beautiful, revolution always has to come from a spirit of the beauty, of a return to excellence, of a cultivation of excellence. Otherwise, you tear something down, you're not going to know what to put in its place because you don't have any standard of excellence to put in its place. And so then you end up, so then we have a culture today of what? Nihilistic deconstruction. You know, because what else can there be? What other freedom is there but deconstruction?
Or to just consume.
Yes, there's consumption or deconstruction. Yeah. Like without beauty as we're describing it, the options are consumption or deconstruction. You can't have like excellence.
Or the third being contribution.
Sure.
Because that's usually what else, when someone does something of excellence, you're actually adding something to the world.
Yes.
Right? And not even just like making things, right? That's one dimension of it, but literally beautiful acts.
Yes.
Beautiful performances or acts or things like, you're literally contributing to existence something that's beautiful, that really should exist.
Completely.
Versus consumption, which you're literally taking away, by the way, or deconstruct, which you're destroying.
I really like that. So consumption, deconstruction, contribution. I think that's a nice way to put it. Where this philosophy of beauty that you're finding in Plato is a philosophy of contribution. Yeah. And contribution's a nice word there because it also can speak to how the individual fits in the community and the community contributes to the individual and the individual to the community, and it not be this either or relationship that leads you into some of the problems that you've seen in the 20th century. So contribution is a wonderful word. So if people want to get a robust philosophy and worldview of contribution by a cultivation of studying beauty, as found in Plato, they need to take your class. So I certainly hope they do. And I assume they'll be able to find it on the Halkyon Guild. .com is where they'll be able to find it. Well, I think it's wonderful that you're teaching that, Thomas. And I'm glad to have I'm still kind of blown away that you're sitting in that couch.
I know,
and I am looking at you. And I really think the topic you're covering, I think it's so important. I think it's so important.
As we discussed, look how animated we got talking about this.
Well, the phrase I always like to say, as you know, is the fate of beauty is the fate of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, the fate of beauty is the fate of us. And if we don't recover this tradition, this notion, this classical appreciation, cultivation of beauty, we can't contribute. All we can do is consume and deconstruct. And that's the story. And I think there's plenty of room for a better story. And I think that better story can be learned at your class. So everyone, go take it. Go sign up at Halkyon Guild today. Mr. Jockin, pleasure speaking with you.
Pleasure talking to you.
It's a delight.